give a snapshot of the wonderful speakers that we've got with us today. I'll introduce them in turn, but big thanks in advance to Josh, Niona, Ollie, and Domenico, who'll be joining the GCHA team today. And then we'll also be hearing from Jenny, Milena, Fabio, Nova, Michelle, and myself on some of the different negotiated items and on NDCs. So without further ado, I believe I'm about to pass over to Jenny. If we move to the next slide. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jess. And thank you to everybody who's joined us here today to dig in a bit to what came out of COP30 and what it means for health. COP is always a big push every year, and as Jess mentioned, it's quite complex and a little daunting. And I think it's useful for us to have these moments where we step back and reflect on what actually happened and what it means. To set a little bit of the context for what the context before going into COP this year, there are a number of sort of key things at the international level that were sort of framing the entry point for the COP negotiations this year. One of them was actually a huge win, a decision by the International Court of Justice. If people could please mute themselves, that would be appreciated. Thank you. There was a decision or an advisory opinion by the International Court of Justice earlier this year, which found that countries have a legal obligation under international law to protect populations from the harms of climate change. This is a groundbreaking decision, something that we should all make ourselves aware of and think about and use to kind of move the needle on this issue. So that was a really important step this year. On the other hand, there were some headwinds, a number of different kinds of headwinds that this year brought us. One is there's shifting geopolitics on a number of fronts. A particularly impactful one is the U.S. Developments in the U.S., U.S. pulling out of the Paris Agreement, U.S. pulling its funding away from the USAID program with ramifications for health programs all around the world, particularly in developing countries. U.S. pulling funding out of the World Health Organization with ramifications for its functioning and staffing and stability. And then U.S. role in kind of rolling back its own climate action and emboldening other countries that are inclined to do the same. This contributed to, but is not the only factor in a highly challenging international financial landscape. Since one of the things that is debated and important to driving forward climate action is climate finance. That is a big factor, the overall international financial landscape. In addition, over the last few years, there have been sort of increasing questions coming up about the effectiveness of multilateralism, of these kind of international fora, particularly these consensus-based arenas like the UNFCCC, whether or not they're effective at achieving the objectives that they were established to achieve. And there have been proposals for reforming the UNFCCC. And then finally, and most soberingly, we have now last year breached the 1.5 degrees of warming level. And climate scientists tell us that it is no longer possible to remain below 1.5 without several years of overshoot. Even if every possible action were taken right now, we will see overshoot above 1.5 of warming. And then the question is, will we do what's necessary to eventually be able to bring that down? And that's where a major push is absolutely essential, urgent, time sensitive, etc. Next slide, please. So at the biggest picture, highest level, what happened at COP30? I think it's worth noting and was much touted that this was the first COP in the Amazon that brought a lot of symbolic interest to this COP and was very much a part of the conversation. Whether that in fact shaped any of the outcomes is a little bit hard to say. I think that on the two sort of biggest and most contentious issues, finance for adaptation and commitment to fossil fuel phase out, we had mixed results on the first, which you'll hear more about later. There has been a commitment to adaptation finance. Unfortunately, it's not on the timeline that developing countries are asking for. And every year of delay in finance costs lives, costs, the stability of health systems, is damaging to national economies and so forth. On fossil fuel phase out, there was a kind of big push at the end for the potential for a roadmap for fossil fuel phase out. And again, we'll hear more about the mitigation component and fossil fuel phase out later. But that didn't pass. And in fact, after the fact, and you may have read about this in the news, it's unclear whether Brazil was actually leading in good faith on this. There are ostensibly 80 plus countries that supported pushing for a roadmap for fossil fuel phase out. Brazil said during the negotiations there were 80 countries opposed. An examination of the two lists found countries on both of those lists and countries that said they were not opposed that were on the opposed lists. So it's not quite clear what was going on there, but the bottom line is we did not get any mention of fossil fuels in any of the outcome texts. There are some key wins in some important areas that we'll get into later. Just transition is a particularly important one. In some areas, there are signals rather than commitments, so something much weaker. But again, we'll get into that when we hear about the negotiated outcomes. But I think the importance of just transition in particular is that may be a realm in which some of the tensions between adaptation and energy transition and fossil fuel phase out can be navigated in a slightly different way and framed in slightly different ways. Many years coming out of COP, I spend the days immediately after COP somewhat depressed because the actions that we need to be taking, as we all know on this call, need to be very ambitious. And we know what's at stake. As health people, we know people's lives are on the line. And the COPs, sort of since the Paris Agreement, have not delivered at the level that they need to put us on track to really protect people's health, limit warming, provide the support for adaptation that's needed, et cetera. And there are always these moments where I ask myself, is this process important? And then a week later, after I've had some sleep and so forth, I come back to the position that I hold the rest of the year, which is that the multilateral process is really important, even if it does only deliver incremental wins. It is the one place where every country has a seat at the table, large, small, developed, developing, heavily impacted by climate change, and not as heavily impacted by climate change. Everybody, every country who wants to has a seat at the table. And that ensures that key issues are aired and addressed, maybe not solved, but they're on the table. But what this also means, because it's a consensus process, we regularly do not get those decisive transformative actions that we're really looking for. And the consequence, the corollary of that is that the work at all other levels is absolutely essential, whether that's work at an individual clinic or hospital to make that clinic and hospital more resilient, more low carbon and climate smart, or at the municipal level. Cities are doing incredible work in addressing some climate change issues. At the national level, at regional levels, in our households, at every single level, the work matters. We need all hands on deck, as the director of the Lancet Countdown recently said in a presentation, including that multilateral process. But we can't rely on that multilateral process to get the job done. We need to see it as part of the picture. So one of the arenas in which health is really growing in presence and significance at the COPs is that for those who have not been to a COP, COP has the negotiating spaces, but then also a tremendous number of pavilions and rooms where side events are held. A few years ago at COP26, the WHO had the first ever health pavilion. So there are a tremendous number of health events happening within the health pavilion. For a few years, we said, well, we need to get health outside of, that's great. And we need health in the other pavilions and in the other side events. That's now happening. There was health in many, many pavilions, which means it's being presented to people who are not just us in the health community, but people going to the Bangladesh pavilion, this Sustainable Development Goals pavilion, and much, much more. At the end of COP, in the closing plenary, there was a bit of drama that really raised questions about the transparency of the negotiations. And overall at this COP, there were a lot of discussions that happened behind closed doors, whereas typically at other COPs, we've seen some closed door discussions and then a plenary session where every country gets to voice its opinion on the draft or where we are in the process. At this COP, we went several days with closed door meetings, closed door meetings, closed door meetings, in which countries also did not all get to hear one another's opinions. By the end, this meant that there hadn't been that same level of transparency in the negotiations. And at the very end, there were a number of procedural issues that were raised that really challenged the COP presidency and said, you're not following protocol. It didn't keep the final closing decisions from actually being decided. We didn't end up with a failed COP, but it was a bit on edge for a time there. And something I didn't mention earlier when talking about the importance of the multilateral process, but that is sort of related to this, Brazil elevated information integrity as a key component of one of the things that it wanted to bring attention to. We've been looking at conflict of interest issues, so the presence of fossil fuel lobbyists at COP and other health harming and climate harming industries at COP. Also the hiring, for example, of PR and communications agencies that also work for fossil fuel companies to be the communication agency that supports the COP and issues like that. And so, with the transparency questions that were raised at the end of COP, along with that was sort of the irony of having a presidency for the first time really elevate this issue of information integrity, but then run a COP that was felt to be not transparent. Looking ahead to coming years, it was finally decided between Turkey and Australia, the two countries that had been vying to host COP31, that it would actually be jointly hosted. It will be physically in Turkey Australia will have a role in running and preparing and running the negotiations. It's not really clear how that's going to work. I think we're going to proceed as though both countries are leading. We'll be, as a community, we should be engaging with both countries. I think it's going to be a little complicated and sticky, and we'll just have to see how that plays out. And then finally, with more clarity and much more advance warning, Ethiopia has been decided to be the host for COP32. And with that, I will turn it back to Jess.
Thanks ever so much, Jenny, for that really, really helpful overview that is going to put the rest of this webinar in excellent context. We are going to amp it up a gear as we move to the next slide. And all of the speakers for the rest of the webinar will have 5 minutes each. There are two different clock emojis in the reaction box. When each speaker gets to 4 minutes, I will send a white clock, and when each speaker gets to 5 minutes, I will send a red clock. Very scary. Um, and at that point, we'd really appreciate it if speakers could wrap relatively quickly. But I won't take up more time myself now. We're going to move to non-negotiated outcomes. And to kick off with, we're going to hear from Josh Carliner, who is Director of Global Partnerships with Healthcare Without Harm. He's also a board member with the Global Climate and Health Alliance, as well as from being one of our founding organizations, and knows certainly much better than I do how to navigate the beast that is the action agenda. Josh, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jess, and good morning, everybody from San Francisco. Jenny sort of talked about how it's really hard to come back from COP, and it is depressing and challenging, and the process can be soul crushing. And I think the thing we need to remember is that there is progress occurring, and if you look at the some of the graphs that people shared. If it wasn't, arguably, if it wasn't for the Paris Agreement and it wasn't for these negotiations, we would be on a track to 3 to 5 degree world. And we're on off track still, but we're on a track to somewhere between 2.3 and 2.8 degrees. Not good, but not as bad as it could be. One of the reasons that that's happening is not just what's happening inside the negotiations, but what's happening sort of in the concentric circles outside of the negotiations. And that's commonly referred to as the action agenda. It depends how you define it. Sometimes, the UNFCCC defines it somewhat narrowly. And if you look at the chart in the slide, the picture on the left side of your screen there, you can see, some of the, some of the stats around the formal action agenda. So there's more than 480 initiatives that were brought together into 117 plans to accelerate solutions in the action agenda that are not governmental initiatives or not consensus-based governmental initiatives. They're often coalitions of the willing. So sometimes it's governments, NGOs, private sector, sometimes it's subnational governments. So before we get into the health part, here's a couple of examples of some of the things that came out of the action agenda and that used the COP to build these coalitions and use the moment to do so. So for black carbon, 9 countries pledged new action on black carbon, which would deliver major health and climate gains. On electric grids, a global alliance of power companies committed to invest $82 billion a year in grids and storage. A group of 14,000 cities, towns, states, regions, provinces committed to spending up the implementation of climate action at the COP30 Local Leaders Forum. And then arguably the fossil fuel work and all the work around the fossil fuel treaty and the 88 governments that actually called for this roadmap are working somewhat outside the process now in this action agenda space. There's also all the work around forests, around the Tropic Forest Forever facility, where $6.7 billion was committed for forest conservation. And I think it's really, there's a lot more around forests and land tenure. But I think it's also important to recognize that these outcomes represent a major shift that's recognizing the role of Indigenous people, Afro-descendants, local communities, that they play in protecting ecosystems that sustain all of us. And so the presence of Indigenous peoples was much larger than it's ever been. And I think larger than the fossil fuel lobbyist contingent. So that's another sort of positive way to look at it. In terms of health, next slide, please. I think one of the biggest achievements of the health sector on the action agenda was the COP26 health program, where 52 national governments committed to low carbon, climate resilient health systems. And that led to the creation of ATTACH. And now we have 100 national health ministries that are committed to and working on decarbonizing and building greater resilience in their health system. So that's an example of how this works. The work that happened in Dubai and the declaration that was endorsed by well over 100 governments at that time on climate and health also was part of the action agenda space. Next slide, please. So in terms of healthcare without harm's work, we work with Race to Zero for Healthcare, which is also something that's supported by the UN high-level champions, and is part of the action agenda. We were able to celebrate 100 institutions from 32 countries representing more than 15,000 hospitals and health centers committed to net zero healthcare. And that's part of a broader action agenda initiative we launched around Paris, where we now have more than 500 institutions from 53 countries committed to climate mitigation, adaptation, and leadership. Next slide, please. The most important thing that came out of the action agenda for health was at Health Day and in Belém, which was the Belém Health Action Plan. And the Belém Health Action Plan is something that GCHA, Healthcare Without Harm, a number of other GCHA members participated in and contributed to the development of. It's a plan on adaptation in the health sector. Next slide, please. And that plan has a number of different elements to it. We can be critical of it in that it's very narrowly focused. Ooh, at least it doesn't have an alarm. Give me 30 seconds more. It's focused on adaptation. It doesn't talk about mitigation. It doesn't talk about fossil fuels. However, it's one chapter in the broader book in this action agenda. And it's a really important plan. It's something that we've endorsed. And it was also backed by an announcement of $300 million from a number of philanthropies, including Rockefeller, Gates, and Wellcome and IKEA foundations. And so it creates a bit of a roadmap around adaptation in the health sector. So again, the big takeaway message is that there's a lot of positive stuff that happens around the COP in this gray area that helps move the agenda forward. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. And there's a lot of good stuff for health there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Josh. And very unfair to give someone a second alarm when it's only just past 6 a.m. in their morning. We're going to move now to Fabio, who's been leading a lot of GCHA's work on NDCs this year. So moving from the action agenda to things strictly at national level, and then we'll see how all of this links back to negotiated outcomes. Fabio, over to you.
Thank you, Jess, and thank you for being here with us today. So I'm going to talk about the NDC, which are the nationally determined contribution. You could say contribution to what? Well, contribution to the Paris Agreement. Basically, the NDCs are the main climate planning tool that a country has, and it highlights all their objectives for the longer term. In this case, it's 10 years. So every country has to submit every 5 years these new updated plans. And this year was an NDC year. It means that before COP, theoretically, all countries had to submit a new and updated NDC 3.0, as they call it. So a new updated plan till 2035, both in actions regarding mitigation and adaptation. Of course, not all countries submitted at the moment. I updated this slide this morning because we have at the moment 121 countries that submitted their updated nationally determined contribution. And these countries altogether cover 74% of the global emissions. Why are they important? Well, because if we look at the first submissions of these NDC back in 2015, almost none of them included health or even adaptation. So when with progress, basically, and with time, it became evident that including an adaptation component, especially if the country is a global south country, is essential in order to correctly plan climate actions for the next years. And in particular, most recently, as Jenny and Josh already highlighted, health has become even more prominent, even within the national determined contribution. More and more countries in their climate action plans, in their national determined contributions, include health as one of the key components of climate adaptation. Of course, countries don't come up with these plans out of nowhere. Ideally, there is kind of an increased ambition kind of principle in which countries should look at their previous submission of their national determined contribution and increase the ambition that they put into their climate action plans, both in mitigation and adaptation. This means that theoretically, every new plan should show strengthen intergovernmental coordination, better inclusion of marginalized people, and also generally a greater ambition in their climate goals. There are a lot of guidelines that the international community puts out there in order to help countries work on this NDC. The most prominent regarding health, of course, is the WHO guidelines. GCHA also worked a lot in supporting countries or showcasing great examples of how a great NDC has been done, or also supporting countries in the CSO, so civil society, in participating in this kind of processes. In general, an NDC should be most of all science-based. So in order to understand what we have to do, we have to understand what is happening in our countries and what can happen in the future. So this so-called climate risk assessment for adaptation, but also the greenhouse gas modeling that basically tells us what are our greenhouse gas reduction plans should also be based on science. A good practice for doing a great NDC, like the recent one just published by Mexico, would basically include also measures that protect the population health, air quality, and food security. So having kind of a transversal way of looking at adaptation and mitigation. Ideally, an NDC is also important because it gives an idea, especially if the NDC comes from the Global South, it gives an idea of where donors and funders could invest money, and which is never sufficient, but invest money in order to deliver the maximum or the best output. Ideally, we want to have health not to be kind of an afterthought in this NDC developing process, but be one of the central pillars of resilience. And we are seeing that in many of the new updated NDCs.
Thank you, Fabio. That was fantastic. And yeah, really, really key to be highlighting how healthy NDCs are, of course, mentioning health and health actions, but also wider science alignment being really crucial. We've got a brief time now for Q&A. I've just been skimming through the chat, and I think there have been responses to some of the points that have been raised. If your point hasn't been addressed yet and you've put it in the chat, or if you've got an additional point that you'd like to make, please do raise your hand now. And great point from Gustavo, not only science, but the best science, the IPCC. Kurt and Serena, if you both want to, Kurt, Serena, and Bidan, if you all three ask your questions, and then we'll have some responses from those that have spoken so far. Kurt.
Yeah, thank you. Very quickly, is there a more detailed assessment of the momentum of the Belém Health Action Plan? I've also had some kind of mixed feelings, but is there progress within its kind of restrictions, which is primarily adaptation of healthcare system, as Josh pointed out? And for the NDCs, I mean, they're still not yet complete. That's probably why you're waiting. But we also want a new update on how important health is, how often it is mentioned. So something we should work on. Thanks.
And
Should I
Serena.
respond now, Jess?
Let's have all three, and then
Okay.
all panelists so far can respond. Thank you, Serena.
Hi, thank you. I'm grateful to be at this webinar and discussion. The running theme that I've identified in the shares so far seems to be one of governance and democratic leadership. At any point, for those that were there for the COP30, were there discussions of the UN 80 reform process? And if so, what were they and to what depth? Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Bidan, and then pass back to Jenny and Fabio and Bidan.
Thank you Thank you to the distinguished panelist. I don't have any question. Rather, I would add another perspective, which is very important, very shortly. So thanks to the speakers for the insightful presentation, and I truly admire the depth of knowledge shared, and I fully agree with the points presented. And I would like to add a perspective from my experience. While the health dimensions have been addressed very well, I believe we are still not giving enough importance to education. And in my view, behavioral change is becoming a major challenge, growing every year, and this directly affects health outcomes. And making education systems climate ready safeguards are, not only learning but also children's health, well-being, and long-term resilience. And education is as essential as health in our climate response. So in this context, I would like to highlight a few key education-related outcomes from COP30, which are very much relevant, I guess. At COP30, the UNESCO-led Greening Education Partnership Ministerial Roundtable emphasized that education must be part of global climate policy, placing schools, curricula, teachers, and communities at the center of climate resilience. And the global launch of the GP dashboard included a mechanism to track how national education systems are integrating climate smart and climate resilience practices. And close to 100 countries, including Bangladesh, have now committed to ensuring the 50% of their education institutions becoming green by 2030, demonstrating a strong global push towards climate ready education. And investing in climate ready education systems strengthens long-term human health and resilience by protecting children from climate-related disruptions that impact learning, well-being, and development. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Piran. Back to Jenny and Josh and Fabio for any responses.
Should I start? Is that okay? Kurt's important question about what's happening with the Belém Health Action Plan. 30 governments and 50 organizations have endorsed it. Your organization can actually endorse the Belém Health Action Plan if you think it's important to do so. We have, and we're committed to sort of working on some components of it as part of our ongoing work. And I think, it's sort of a glass half full, glass half empty thing. 30 governments is not a huge number, but it's a good start. I think, getting more and more governments on board is something that the Brazil presidency through the course of the year is going to try to do. And it is, it encompasses a lot of existing work. It's a way to pull it together, but also put it in a sort of a strategic and comprehensive approach. So, I think the jury's out on how effective and how important it'll be over time. But it's something that is a vehicle that's there to use and to build on. And just very quickly on governance, I would say I didn't hear any discussion of what you were asking about, but there is a general agreement that the COP process is broken and ineffective. And there are a number of different initiatives to try to reform it. Whether that happens or not, that's a whole other question, and it's a much bigger discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. Anything that Jenny wants to add, or Fabio?
I can just add on the question about assessing and analyzing the current crop of NDCs for their integration of health. That actually is something that GCHA will be doing in the coming months. We will be analyzing them and producing another edition of our Healthy NDC scorecard, where we evaluate integration of health and then actually compare how countries have done in terms of that. So that, stay tuned for that. That will be coming in the next few months.
Thank you. And maybe if I can just draw the panelists' attention to a couple of the more recent points in the chat. We'll go back to panel presentations now, unless there's anything that Fabio wants to add, but if it's possible to respond to points in the chat too, that would be wonderful.
Okay, to respond, okay. Should I respond or?
Please.
Okay. No, sorry. No, I also don't know about the reform about the UNAID, Serena, but I think it's super important. I think COP was not maybe the moment in which this thing would be discussed, but there are others within the UN system. I hope comes through. Regarding the inclusion of education, I think the idea and what we as GCHA advocate is really looking at health more in an holistic way. So not really looking at health systems, but really trying to have this transversal lens. And education is one of the enabling sectors that, of course, gives health, improves resilience also within the health outcomes and so on. I really like that Oliver already put the evaluation of the integration of nutrition in various NDCs. So this is another part that we are not looking at, but there is a lot of work in trying to understand what is working in NDCs and what can be done in the future, also because the work doesn't stop in publishing an NDC. Now it's also time to implement it. And the NDCs as climate finance should not be seen as a ceiling, but as a floor of climate ambition.
Thanks, Fabio. And my internet has cut in and out a little bit, so if at any point anyone can't hear me, please flag it in the chat. But one more point on UNFCCC reform is that, yeah, as part of wider UN reform discussions, that there are questions within the COP process on what voting should look like, whether it should be consensus-based or majority-based, and then also, yeah, what level of influence it's acceptable, what level of influence and participation it's acceptable for industry representatives to have, especially those which are polluting. We're going to move to the next slides now on negotiated outcomes. And just as a little bit of background on the next slide to this, there is no dedicated health negotiating stream at COP. There are still literally over 100 different negotiating streams that are relevant for health. And this is because climate change is a leading threat of people everywhere. Therefore, in order to protect health, we need ambitious climate decision making. And that's whether it's explicitly related to health or whether the decision that is made has implications for the climate and therefore for health. So at COPs, health can be leveraged to support ambitious climate outcomes, and the health gains of these decisions must be optimized. So although there are no health-specific agenda items in the slides that follow, the different presenters will try really clearly to make the links to health and what the implications are. And at this point, I will hand over, I think, to Nova, who's GCHA's postdoctoral researcher. No, not quite. We're going to hear from different members of the GCHA team and other experts on the Mutarao decision, which was the COP cover decision, then on adaptation and just transition, which were perhaps high up the agenda on the expectations of what would come out of COP. Mitigation and loss and damage. We'll then pause for questions before moving into finance, the global stocktake, gender, agriculture, and Article 6. Each presenter will touch on 5 different areas. When we were heading into COP, what did we think it would deliver? What were the issues of divergence? What did different negotiating blocs think about the issues that are being covered? Was health explicitly raised, either in the interventions that countries made or in the text that was adopted? What was eventually decided and what happens next? What should we be focusing on as the health community, and what's the timeline in the process? And now I will hand over to Nova to walk us through the Mutarao decision. Thanks, Nova.
Thanks, Jess. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody on the call. So the Mutarao decision, this is essentially, as Jess said, the cover decision. And the expectation going into COP30 was, it was very uncertain if there would be any cover decision, but the COP30 presidency kind of gave some signals that there would be. There were some politics that happened prior to COP30 and then during the first week of COP30. And part of the politics were there were these 4 agenda items that were proposed to get on the agenda, but they didn't have full consensus from all of the parties. And so instead of holding up any adoption of the agenda, the COP presidency decided to put all 4 into this big bucket called presidency consultations that happened throughout the first week. And this is what eventually turned into the Mutarao kind of discussions. But the 4 agenda item proposals, one was the Paris Agreement's Article 9.1 on public finance, which is the obligation of developed countries to give finance to developing countries for adaptation and mitigation. The second one was on NDCs and response to the 1.5 degree gap, meaning the NDCs are there, but obviously we're not hitting our mark with the target, and that was proposed by the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS. The third one was regarding biennial transparency reports, the synthesis reports of those, and what kind of to do with them as they had just come out this last couple years. And then the fourth one is on unilateral trade measures. And this essentially arose from concerns by developing countries regarding developed countries, particularly the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, which basically puts a carbon price on certain products that are being imported into the EU based on environmental standards. So these four were agenda items that were proposed to be on the agenda. Ultimately, they didn't want to hold up the agenda, so then it got put into these presidency consultations that were then negotiated the first and the second week. In terms of health, in the final kind of text, the human right to health and to a clean, healthy, sustainable environment was included in the final text. And then there was also this one sentence paragraph saying acknowledge economic and social benefits and opportunities of climate action, including economic growth, job creation, improved energy access and security, and improved public health. So health is kind of mentioned in this text, although it's somewhat slim. Next slide, please. And then the final text, kind of what happened in the cover decision. One on NDCs, there is this global implementation accelerator and the Belém mission to 1.5. It's very vague on what both of these mean. I wish I could provide more detail, but it is kind of vague, so we'll have to see what those kind of come to be. Finance, I believe we'll have finance slides later on, but finance was included in this final text. Regarding trade, there was a sentence on it, and it also is vague. You'll see a lot of this is vague. And then the IPCC, which throughout COP30 had a lot of disagreement on whether the IPCC provides the best available science. In the cover decision, it read as best available science for effective climate action and policymaking as provided by the IPCC. So what's next? The Global Implementation Accelerator sessions are going to be conducted at SP64. And then report on the Belém mission to 1.5 is going to be produced at COP31. And then there will be dialogues on enhancing international cooperation. And that's the cover decision in a very high level and quick form. Thanks. Jess?
Thanks, Nova. I'll move us on now to adaptation and specifically the global goal on adaptation. So what we were really hoping for from COP30 was the adoption of a set of 100 indicators that had been prepared by a group of experts over the last 18 months to 2 years. A set of those indicators did focus on health. In addition to having a lot of those thematic and process-related indicators, it was really important that COP30 also reached consensus on means of implementation indicators, which is finance and technology transfer and capacity building, because we know that we won't see any progress on health or on water or on sanitation unless there are resources available for countries to be able to implement actions to support those goals. Important to mention that there were politics there around whether or not domestic finance or overseas development assistance or private finance should be counted as climate finance. And under Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement, the obligation is from developed countries to developing countries to provide that finance. And that should be new and additional. So on top of what's already provided as part of overseas development assistance, which was agreed before climate finance was a thing. Specifically, there was a call from least developed countries, LDCs, in the next couple of slides, to triple adaptation finance. There was an agreement at COP26 in Glasgow to double adaptation finance from 2019 to 2025. That would have taken adaptation finance to $40 billion US dollars. Adaptation finance is actually declining, but what LDCs are asking for was to triple that 40 billion to 120 billion by 2030. Some of the worries among developing countries about the indicators that were proposed under the Global Goal on Adaptation, the GGA, were that they'd be faced with this additional reporting burden without finance and other resources to build the data systems to do the reporting. And there'd also been some hints from some climate finance entities that preference would be given for the allocation of climate finance to countries that were already reporting on global goal and adaptation indicators, which understandably made some developing countries very anxious. Despite these strong calls for means of implementation indicators, there were comments from developed countries in week one on how they heard the concerns, but not necessarily that they were going to do anything about means of implementation indicators. There was a proposal from least developed countries to come out of Belém with indicators that were operationalizable, that were close to being implementable, and proposed setting up a roster of experts and a process for indicator refinement. The AGN preferred to not yet adopt the indicators. The AGN is the Africa group of negotiators and preferred to extend the work program by 2 years to be able to finalize indicators. And on finance, the ask from least developed countries was supported by the Alliance of Small Island States and Group Sur, but was opposed by the EU and the Environmental Integrity Group because the timeline was different to the new collective quantified goal, which runs to 2035 and doesn't break down how much finance for mitigation versus adaptation. So was seen as being different to that. Next slide, please. In terms of what we saw as mentions of health, of course, there was the discussion that related to indicators, including health, and we did get informal feedback that thanks to the incredible work of the health experts, that the health indicators were actually of relatively strong quality. The Africa group of negotiators commented how inadequate finance for climate action means that resources actually have to be directed away from health. We've also heard this from the Bridgetown report led by Barbados, and Singapore noted that making progress on the GGA in general is crucial for health and other outcomes that we want to see. In the end, the presidency, rather than having parties adopt the list of 100 indicators, proposed a list of 59 indicators in the hope of addressing some of what some parties had expressed as their concerns. Some of the difficulties here is that the way that the indicators are written means that they can't actually be operationalized. There isn't actually a way to measure them. The language is more like what parties wanted to hear, but it's not possible to track progress on them as they stand. There have been some heat-specific indicators that are removed. There's an indicator on wider climate impacts. And there's nothing specific anymore on occupational health. There are means of implementation indicators in line with the Paris Agreement, which is really encouraging. There's really a lack of clarity. There are different things in the decision on what the next steps will be for finalizing the methods for these indicators. There's language on the tripling of adaptation finance, which is what LDCs had asked for, but rather than being by 2030, the timeline is for 2035, and there's no baseline. There'll be a 2-year Baku adaptation roadmap, which includes strengthening the implementation of adaptation for health and other targets and relates back to tracking the indicators. And there'll be 2 workshops each year. On that for the next 2 years, anyone interested in shaping those workshops and that process can make a submission by the 28th of February. And as the health community, we should be maintaining that we need good indicators for health, but also for health determining sectors like water and sanitation. And we need those means of implementation or we won't see progress. I'll stop there and hand, I think, back to Nova on just transition. And I'll post a link for submissions in the chat, Zoe. Thank you.
Okay, back to me talking about just transition, which was one of the, I would say, a focus for some groups at this COP. The expectation was to create a potential institutional arrangement to help implement a just transition. And this just transition work program was created at COP28, I believe. And so the expectation was to actually have something to implement this work program and just transition overall. Wanted to have a mention of fossil fuels, and obviously we wanted some language on health related to workers, heat, clean cooking, etc. There was a lot of politics surrounding this just transition negotiation stream. One, particularly kind of after the first week, was this whether there should be a just transition mechanism, which is kind of much of a stronger institutional arm to help implement, or an action plan, which is more of a less strong and more within kind of the work program itself, where the mechanism might be a bit more outside of the program. There was also disagreement on whether fossil fuels should be included in the text. There's a lot of countries, particularly those that rely on fossil fuels for their economy, that don't want fossil fuels anywhere near the just transition and don't want it in the text at all. There was also talk about this transitional fuels. And if you're wondering what transitional fuels are, I mean, most likely it's gas, but there is no actual definition anywhere. But some countries want to add transitional fuels as well into this work program. And then there were further this politics of unilateral trade measures, as I mentioned in the cover decision slide, but it also showed up here in the just transition as well. In terms of health and negotiations, so the two kind of the human rights to health, so the right to health and then the right to a clean, healthy, sustainable environment, that showed up in this text and also in the negotiations. Further, the health benefits of clean cooking was not only mentioned during the negotiations, but also ended up in the text. The health co-benefits of renewable energy, including air pollution, and that's kind of the big thing that came out of this text was it specifically mentioned air pollution when talking about the health co-benefits of renewable energy. So that was really awesome to see. And then finally, there was text about the care economy and informal workers that I believe was included by the EU. So definitely trying to get more of an inclusive part in terms of the text here. So as I said, the health mentions did stay in the decision text. All of them did. What ended up being decided was this just transition mechanism, although there is a bit limited detail of what this mechanism is going to be and how it's going to work and all of that. But there was agreement that the mechanism, as opposed to the action plan, would be moving forward with this work program, so much stronger of an arm. Unfortunately, there became no language on fossil fuel at all, fossil fuel phase out. It was in the text at some point, but what happens in these is in a text, it'll be 3 different options, and one option includes it and another option doesn't, and then you have to kind of figure out at the end what option made it in. So no fossil fuels, but there's also no language on these transitional fuel or the vital role of transitional fuels. So that also wasn't in there. So what's next is because they decided on a just transition mechanism, they're inviting parties and I believe non-party stakeholders to submit thoughts and views on the mechanism by March 15th of next year. So that's coming in. And with that, I hand it back to Jess.
Thanks, Nova, and I'll hand straight over to Milena to walk us through mitigation. And there's actually a question to you in the chat, Nova, if you want to prep for when we get to the break. Thank you, Milena.
Thanks so much. I'm GCHA's liaison officer in Latin America and the Caribbean, and I'm happy to present on this item of mitigation as Latin American countries have showed some leadership at COP30. So mitigation is at the heart of COP and the Paris Agreement because it determines how the world reduces emissions to limit warming, to protect lives, and to keep 1.5 within reach. Every fraction of avoided warming prevents illness, deaths, and the collapse of health systems. There are also additional benefits for public health from climate action in different sectors, energy generation, transport, buildings, agriculture, and land use. And mitigation is talked about in many negotiation streams and there is one specific program on mitigation, but first I'm going to touch on the conversation that took place outside of the COP agenda and was meant to land into the cover decision, the mutirão. It started way ahead of COP with the Brazilian presidency announcing COP30 as a COP of implementation and a moment to operationalize the commitments taken in the global stocktake in Dubai, including transitioning away from fossil fuels. As the Leaders Summit at the Leaders Summit and the COP opening, the President Lula called for roadmaps for reversing deforestation and overcoming the dependence of fossil fuels and mobilizing resources required. The global emissions come from fossil fuels, which harm human health at every age, from extraction through transport to disposal. And on the other hand, particularly for Brazil and other Latin American countries, deforestation is linked to over 50% of their emissions, so very relevant for their mitigation efforts and for safeguarding the health of local communities. So both the roadmaps on transitioning away from fossil fuels and halting and reversing deforestation are essential for climate stability, and both directly reduce health harms. What happened with the roadmaps? At first, within the first week, the roadmap for transitioning away from fossil fuels gained strong international backing. Around 80 countries allegedly supported it, including the Independent Alliance of Latin American and Caribbean Countries, ILAC, the Alliance of Small Island States, IOSIS, the European Union, the UK, the Environmental Integrity Group, which also includes Mexico, Australia, and others, but a similarly large group, including the Arab group, the like-minded developing countries, Russia, India, and others, opposed its inclusion in the final text. The deforestation roadmap was linked to the fossil fuel one in the same paragraph, and also with the argument that without addressing the main drivers of climate change, there could be no real progress on reducing and halting deforestation. So consensus could not be reached, and COP30 did not deliver a fossil fuel roadmap nor a deforestation roadmap, and no explicit reference to fossil fuels in the decisions were made. In response, a coalition of the willing countries has emerged, and Colombia and the Netherlands will host the first international conference on fossil fuels in Santa Marta in April 2026 to continue advancing this ambition. And in the final plenary, the COP presidency committed to designing two inclusive science-based roadmaps on fossil fuel transition and deforestation. And these will be developed through high-level dialogues with a broad range of stakeholders, and will be informed by the outcomes of the Santa Marta conference. And both roadmaps will be then reported back at COP31. And now turning to the mitigation work program. Its mandate is to urgently scale up mitigation ambition and implementation in this critical decade, accelerating emission reduction, supporting transitioning away from fossil fuels, strengthening NDCs, and enabling sectoral transformation. So during the year, it organizes dialogues on different sectors and mitigation solutions, and also the scope of the problem and the challenges. But politically, divergence on its scope and mandate are shaping the outcomes. So many parties, including small island developing states, Latin American countries, and the European Union, expected the mitigation work program to carry forward the GST outcomes on fossil fuel and ambitions, but the outcomes were not substantial, have not been during the duration of the whole program. Colombia notably proposed that one of the 2026 global dialogues focus explicitly on transitioning away from fossil fuels. However, this was strongly opposed by the Arab group, also like-minded developing countries, Russia, China, who insisted that the topic has been already selected, which is industry. Colombia then objected to the adoption of the mitigation work program decision in the final plenary, saying that there could be no real mitigation of climate change if the international community could not discuss transitioning away from fossil fuels. But the decision was rapidly gaveled by the COP30 president, and their flag was ignored. On health, the final decision does not include any explicit references, despite the clear evidence that was contained in the report from the 2025 dialogues on the program on the waste and the forest sectors. Under the waste sector, mentions underscore the public health benefits of reducing methane emissions, and the forest dialogue emphasizes forest's essential role for health, food, and water security, also for indigenous peoples and land rights. There were also mentions of transitioning to healthy lifestyles and sustainable consumption, but none of that stayed in the final decision. So the COP30 decision of the mitigation work program reaffirms that it's non-prescriptive and only takes notes of the voluntary key messages from the dialogues. Parties will revisit the question of the future of the mitigation work program in 2026. And parties and observers are invited to submit proposals by the 1st of February on the topics of the global dialogues, an opportunity to reintroduce the themes such as fossil fuel transition and health. And by the 15th of April, submissions are due on the future and continuity of the mitigation work program so that it can be discussed at the bond sessions. And that was all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Milena. Final presentation of this block is on loss and damage from Michelle, who's GCHA Policy Coordinator. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Jess. So I just want to start by quickly reviewing some of the terms that you will hear in loss and damage discussions. Santiago Network, which is known to be the connector, providing technical assistance and connecting with countries and communities. You'll also hear of the FRLD on the bottom right corner, which is the provider or the fund that contributes to reconstruction, recovery, and rehabilitation. And then you also hear of EXCOM, or the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism, which is seen as the brain that guides the implementation and shares new knowledge on loss and damage. And as we know, with climate inaction, we'll continue to see consequences in the forms of economic and non-economic loss and damage. And when it comes to health, health is usually categorized under non-economic loss and damage, despite, we are aware that there are some economic considerations, but under the UNFCCC, it's usually considered a non-economic form of loss and damage. So firstly, the expectations going into COP30. There were calls for a permanent agenda item on loss and damage to guarantee yearly negotiations and moving beyond technical discussions. There was also a call for a more ambitious resource mobilization strategy for the fund for responding to loss and damage. There was also a call for a loss and damage gap report that would analyze the needs and where we currently are and basically see that gap and that difference and how much work is needed. And then there's also a call for scaled up finance in the completion of the WIM review. So the WIM review was, it was hoped that it would be completed at COP29, and it was finally completed at COP30. And there were calls for that review to also include guidance on scaling up the finance that's needed for loss and damage. So in terms of the politics, the main divergence was on linking FRLD to the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage and paragraph 16 of the NCQG, so the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. And this is significant because paragraph 16 of the NCQG speaks to increasing public finance to all climate funds and funding mechanisms under the UNFCCC. And so there were discussions in the legal community on if this includes loss and damage and the loss and damage fund. And so there was a push to make sure that in the decision text related to the FRLD that there was a call or a link to paragraph 16. And so there was disagreement between developed and developing countries, and some of them are listed here on the screen. Developed countries tend to tend to oppose it and share concerns and say that they would prefer that all of the paragraphs of the NCQG be included and not just specifically paragraph 16. And some of the conversation around this was that if they include all paragraphs of the NCQG, that they would have to include paragraphs speaking to exploring innovative financial instruments, and it would dilute the commitment to increasing public finance and grants. So that was the main divergence between developing and developed countries. Next slide, please. So the outcomes. In the end, FRLD did link to the NCQG paragraph 16 in the final text, which the loss and damage community considers a win, as it speaks to the obligation for public finance, not only for some of the other financial mechanisms, but also making it clear that this includes loss and damage as well. We also had the completion of the Warsaw International Mechanism, and this was important because in that text, it spoke to the loss and damage gap report that many have been asking for. So they did agree to produce a loss and damage gap report that will present evidence-based practices, policies, the needs, all of the different considerations for loss and damage, looking at how far we've come and how far we need to go, essentially. And this will be done on a multi-year frequency, but this specific frequency has not been identified as yet. We also have the launch of the Barbados Implementation Modalities, also known as the BIM. And this is the first phase of dissemination for the Loss and Damage Fund. So on the first day of COP that was launched, the call for funding requests was launched. But on the other side of this, there is a lot of criticism on the lack of guidance in terms of increasing the fund, and a lot of criticism around the lack of pledges and the lack of a call for developed countries to provide new pledges. So at COP30, we saw Spain and we saw Switzerland pledge a little over $20 million. And while this is welcomed, it's just not nearly enough to get to what is needed for developing countries. And so this was some of the criticism. On the other hand, while people are happy that they're launching the first phase of 250 million USD, there's still a lot more finance needed and not enough countries coming forward to pledge and not enough guidance in the text to encourage this. So what's next? Parties have been invited to submit recommendations and views on the guidance for the fund for responding to loss and damage, and this should be done prior to COP31. There's no specific date identified as yet. And some other possibilities to consider in terms of what's next for the health community. We could consider advocating for inclusion of health expert analysis and contribution to the loss and damage gap report to make sure that health is included in the non-economic loss and damage knowledge products that will come out as a result of this gap report. Identify ways to integrate loss and damage, non-economic loss and damage, such as health, in the knowledge products of the WIM, identify ways to quantify health loss and damage beyond the non-economic classification, and then also advocate for additional funding for the FRLD to address climate ambition in general, and then to also address the current deficit as well as health-related loss and damage. Thank you so much, Jess. Back to you.
Thanks, Michelle. I can see that Mark has if we move to the next slide on Q&A, and we can probably stop screen sharing for a minute. Yeah, a question from Mark, if you want to pose that out loud, and then I can read out a couple of points from the chat, one of which I think is to me, and one of which could either be picked up by Nova or Milena or Fabio, but I'll get to those in a minute. Mark, you first. Do you have a hand raised, Mark, or is that maybe accidental? You're on mute at the moment. I could start by reading out the questions in the chat, but feel free to unmute yourself.
The University of Tokyo did the original research that found that forest bathing, an hour a day, gives each of us an extra 10 years of health. And that research has been proven over and over again. So that's an example of climate change keeping the forest and making sure people can get out in the forest. An hour a day, they call it forest bathing, deep in the forest, increases each person's health by 10 years.
Thanks for sharing that, Mark. And my own connection is skipping a bit, so I'll go off video for a minute, but please type in the chat if I'm not audible, but hopefully everybody could hear Mark. Two questions to pick out in the chat. And Nova, I think you've answered Deanna's question on just transition, but Deanna, please come back if there's anything else needed. So one point from Taran on the global goal on adaptation indicators. is around the assessment of the health-specific indicators and a request to whether we could speak more about whether the indicators that were adopted are appropriate or what changes and additions might strengthen them. And Diana was also keen for some clarity there, so we can go into that. And then there was a question from, two questions from Bidan. One on how the COP process will account for non-economic health losses like disability, long-term illness, and mental health impacts. And one more, let me just find it in the chat from Bidan, on whether future NDCs will require countries to integrate measurable health indicators linked to mitigation. And yeah, let's stop there and see if anybody, either from the batch of presenters that just spoke, or Fabio, if you want to come in on NDCs, please do. I can kick off on the global goal on adaptation question. So I won't run through indicator by indicator, but just to give two examples of indicators. Diana, these were adopted. They can be found through the link to the GGA decision that's on the adaptation slide. If anyone from the GCHA team wants to put that in the chat, please do. Otherwise, I can do it in a minute. But two examples of indicators. There's one on the rate of mortality, and this is the indicators that were adopted. There's one on the rate of mortality associated with climate impacts. That was initially specific to heat exposure, and it's possible to do climate attribution for heat exposure. It's a lot trickier for other kinds of climate impact. So this will be more challenging to monitor. And then there was another indicator which now reads to be around the level of incidence of climate infectious diseases, including as an outcome of adaptation actions. And this was to make it more relevant for adaptation and for the global goal on adaptation. The problem is that the change in incidence of climate-sensitive infectious diseases, it's not methodologically feasible to attribute infectious disease incidence to adaptation actions. We can track the change in incidence, but we can't attribute it to adaptation actions. I'll stop there and see if anybody else would like to come in and respond to any of those other questions and comments. Thank you.
And briefly touch upon the NDC one. So just to clarify, there is nothing compulsory in an NDC except from the mitigation part. So in general, NDC is something that the UNFCCC process requires countries to do, and it's mainly focused on mitigation. So a country should mainly highlight their 10-year, in this case, 10-year goal on reduction of fossil fuel emissions. The adaptation part is entirely voluntary, but as I mentioned before, having an NDC with clear objectives and in both mitigation and adaptation, especially if it comes from a country in the global south, can help investors and in particular funders basically direct the investment in or grants, ideally, or loans to a country following what is in the NDC, because theoretically these are the priority areas identified by the country itself where climate action should happen within the time frame specified by the NDC. But it's nothing like compulsory. Of course, we want to see health because in a sense, it highlights the fact that the country prioritize climate action within the health systems or climate action in health in general as one of the pillars of their climate action plans.
Thanks, Fabio. And I'm going to pass to Michelle for her responses in just a moment. But for any of the speakers that are coming up in the next block, let me know if you need to leave exactly on the half hour and we can put you first. And otherwise, I'd be grateful if folks wouldn't mind staying on the line for just 15 additional minutes after the scheduled end of this webinar. But Michelle, over to you for responses, and then we'll go to the final presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess. I wanted to respond to the loss and damage questions. Firstly, from Bidan, how will COP processes account for non-economic health losses like disability, long-term illness, and mental health impacts in loss and damage assessments? So what I can share on that is that during COP30, for the Warsaw International Mechanism text, they decided that they will enhance, so it's kind of vague, but it's there in the text that they will enhance their work on non-economic loss and damage and develop knowledge products for non-economic loss and damage. So I think we'll have to see when there are calls for, hopefully calls for submission for input into that. But that is what I've seen so far in terms of how they intend to address loss and damage, non-economic loss and damage. And then Caroline, has there yet been any review as to the first experiences implementing and whether the World Bank has been able to meet stipulations set on it as a host of the FRLD? So I'm curious to hear if anybody else might have heard anything on this so far, but so far from my end, I haven't heard anything on the first experiences since the fund was launched on the first day of COP.
Thanks ever so much, Michelle. Milena, if we could go back to sharing slides, we're going to hear next, and I think her internet connection might be a little bit challenging. So Niona, let us know if it's not a good moment for you. But Nakuya Niona Kasakende is the Gender, Health and Environment Lead at Regenerate Africa. She's a reproductive health expert and a public health enthusiast by education. She's pursuing her master's in public health. She's a green project manager by training, and she's a health, gender and climate change advocate by both passion and profession. Niona, if you can hear me, would you like to speak now?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jace. I'm sorry about the mishap with the network. Hello, everybody. So I'll just dive right in. Well, the expectation as we're going into COP30 was for the adoption of the 9-year Gender Action Plan. That was inclusive of activities closely related to health. Those, for instance, in the draft Gender Action Plan, there was under the theme on capacity building and knowledge management, an activity on increasing knowledge on emerging issues like sexual and reproductive health and rights, gender-based violence, and unpaid care work in the context of gender and climate change. So our expectation was that that would be adopted, but the politics around this issue was that there were a lot of disagreements, of course, around the wording in regards to the word sexual and rights when it came to the text, and that was brought up by countries like Namibia, but there are also others, the other contentions on maybe leaving out the sexual and then just stating it as rights. So instead of sexual and reproductive health and rights, we would just leave it as health, which is also great. Which was also a great addition to the text. But there was also an option that was stated on leaving out, the text completely on sexual and reproductive health, on health in general, and also on issues related to GBV and unpaid care work, and that was by Saudi Arabia. But of course, there are also, other talks around, leaving wording around key emerging issues so that the text could read increasing knowledge around emerging issues. In the context of gender and climate change, so that countries can decide for themselves what emerging issues they have, and we don't list the emerging issues. And of course, this is the very first time we ever saw footnotes in text in COP discussions. And of course, these footnotes were not really around aspects of health and sexual and reproductive health or gender-based violence, but they are around the definition on gender, of which countries like Paraguay, Iran, the Holy See, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Argentina were specifically stating that health should be described as male and female as per their different country policies, but also as to some of the international documents that are out there. So I would love to go to the next slide, please. Yes. So in regards to what was discussed in the negotiations, There were aspects of integrating. There was a sole activity, like I mentioned, on SRHR, gender-based violence, and unpaid care work. But there was a suggestion of merging that activity with an activity around evidence-based, strengthening the evidence base around in helping us understand the differentiated impacts and opportunities around climate change and climate action on women. It goes on and on. It's really long, but that was a hope for us because we saw that they included under the I would say the deliverables that countries were called to make submissions on findings of national assessments on relevant issues. And then they give an example of some of these issues that they would require countries to develop evidence on. And that included health, violence against women and girls, and care work. So you can see that the language changed a little bit from sexual and reproductive health to health, which is still a great thing. And then from gender-based violence to violence against women and girls. It was just really terminologies. But at the end of the day, we were happy to see that there was some text that was, integrated on health. And we have an entry point as organizations on health to generate more evidence around the gendered impact of climate change on health. So, of course, moving on from here, it's important that according to the way these activities have been stated within the 9-year Gender Action Plan, which is running from 2026 to 2034, it's important that we realize that these activities are stated in a sense that they're looking at national assessments. So they're not looking at a lot of activities on health, at the international scene. So it's a call to all civil society organizations on the call to make sure that as countries are doing their gender assessments, maybe as they're developing their gender action plans at national level, that we use such avenues to call for the integration of health within our national gender action plans, because we want to see it go beyond the evidence. We want to see it now move into the action. How are the local communities are going to actually now benefit from the different, services, gender-related services that can be given unto them. So it now goes beyond the evidence to now also, of course, slipping into the policy aspects as well. Is gender and is health reflected within the gender policies at our national levels? So that is some work that we have to do, and this is included, of course, under the activity on evidence generation. I repeat, on 8.3 within the Gender Action Plan, which is linked for everyone to be able to access that. Thank you, Jess, and back to you.
Thank you, Niona, very, very much. There's one question for you in the chat, if you're able to address it in writing, because we are getting short on time now, but thank you so much for that. And I'll hand over now to Oliver Camp, who's going to walk us through agriculture. Oliver's part of the policy team at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, and also part of the core group for the COP27 initiative on climate action and nutrition, as well as the Food and Land Use Coalition, and a member of the International Climate Politics Hub. Ollie, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jess, and thanks for having me. I've benefited a lot from the GCHA in the past, so nice to contribute something for a change. Let me make an obvious point. I mean, food systems and nutrition people don't often turn up on calls related to health, but I hope that you'll all agree that agriculture links to health incredibly closely, given that in the context of climate change, hundreds of millions of people will experience food insecurity, and probably billions of people will be at greater risk of malnutrition and micronutrient deficiencies as well. So if this isn't already an area you think about in your day-to-day, then I would implore you to start thinking about it, because nutrition really is on the front end of everything we need to be thinking about. So we've got a bit of a blessing and a curse in the food systems and agriculture community, in that we do, unlike health, have dedicated negotiations. So coming into this COP, we were all, of course, keeping an eye on the so-called Sharm Joint Work, or that's the abbreviated version, which is where we were going to discuss the outcomes of a workshop back in June in Bonn about taking a more systemic and holistic approach to food security and climate action. Now, this has always been a contentious issue, because a lot of countries have wanted to really keep the focus on agriculture, and quite often on adaptation in agriculture. That's specifically really in developing countries. Developed countries perhaps generally are more open to the idea of taking a more systemic approach. And the advantage of a systemic approach for all of us is that that brings in topics about, say, diets, healthy and sustainable diets, and other issues like food value chains, food loss and waste, and so on. So that was a really big issue coming in, and this workshop report was discussed in the first week. But unfortunately, the discussions were quite short at COP30. They were over really by Thursday evening, with only procedural conclusions to say good discussions were had, nothing was specifically agreed, we'll try again in Bonn next year. And we were a bit dissatisfied with that. Then again, we do have the opportunity to pick up again in Bonn, and some of the discussions perhaps were more productive in previous years. But then I say it's a blessing and a curse because alongside that kind of core focus on the Sharm joint work, we really feel that food systems, food security, nutrition, and climate should be represented across the negotiations, as I'm sure we agree on the health side as well. So we were looking at things like the Global Golden Adaptation Indicators and other areas like the Mitigation Work Programme and follow up to the workshops and dialogues held this year. And unfortunately there, things were pretty tough going as well. We've heard a bit about the GGA indicators, very well described by Jess, but we cut down the list of 10 potential indicators for food and agriculture to only 5, losing a couple of really crucial ones as we did, including on means of implementation for adaptation in agriculture. And also we had some of those methodology and attribution issues, which will make it pretty difficult to track those 5 indicators that remain. So I think the jury's out on how useful those can be going forward. And then the other point that I just mentioned on this slide was there was some hope we might be able to be specific about finance to agriculture. I know there weren't really formal negotiations about finance this year. Maybe here there were a couple of opportunities. The Baku to Belém roadmap did include food systems as a key area where more finance needed to flow, so that was encouraging, but still much, much more to be done. There are various other debates about things like definitions, as I've mentioned on this slide, but in the interest of time, let's jump over to the next slide and I'll just quickly close up. If we could have the next one, please. Thanks, Milena. There we go. Yeah, so health. Maybe just to start with the point that I put in the chat earlier, we have been looking with anticipation at the NDCs. And it is true that nutrition is coming out in slightly more NDCs than when we assessed the previous round, but still not many, still not enough. So we really do think there's an opportunity for countries to take more action on nutrition explicitly and specifically within their NDCs, going beyond just the idea of food security and addressing hunger. And then, as I say, we've had those various issues across the negotiations. The only positive I might try to end on is to say that there are a couple more references now to certain groups, so things like smallholder farmers and, of course, indigenous peoples in some areas like the Just Transition Work Programme. And then, in fact, on the finance side also, we did have the Standing Committee on Finance acknowledging in their work plan that they would look at more finance going to food going forward. But we have much more to do here. So what's next? Well, there is still a need for more on advocacy, really just explaining why we need to expand focus beyond this area of adaptation in agriculture. I draw a slight parallel here to what we heard earlier about the adaptation focus of the Belém Health Action Plan. But there is obviously so much more to be done there. And then really integrating food systems and climate policy. Ironically, we have great food systems policies in lots of countries, but it's not necessarily represented in climate policy, and that cuts off opportunities for us to get climate finance going to food systems and having those double duty investments in climate and nutrition. And then very specifically, we can work on things like the means of implementation workshop coming up in Bonn under the Sharm joint work. And of course, we can work on those challenged areas that I mentioned on the GGA and mitigation work programme. Final point, the action agenda was pretty good. So when I say that other things are moving more quickly, the negotiated outcomes may have been discouraging, but the action agenda is more encouraging. And maybe that's one to watch in future. Jess, thank you. I hope I didn't go too far over time. Back to you.
No, that was wonderful. Thanks ever so much, Ollie. And there is one question in the chat from earlier in the call from Douglas, in case you want to send any sort of written response to that. Thank you ever so much. Final guest speaker, and then a few more points from Nova and Jenny and me, and we'll aim to finish in the next 10 minutes. But over to you, Domenico. Domenico is with the Osservatorio Parigi and also the Metabolism of Cities Living Lab at San Diego State University, and holds the irreplaceable role of telling us all what Article 6 means for health. Domenico, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jess. I will be very quick. Here a slide just to wrap up on Article 6 that is mainly negotiated on 3 sub-article 6.2 that is regarding all the cooperative approach, so how to contribute with NDC, also with the so-called international transferable mitigation outcomes. Article 6.4 that is designing a new carbon market after the clean development mechanism, and Article 6.8 that is regarding the so-called norm market approach. Next slide, please. Just to summarize the results over these three, you can say, substream on negotiation under Article 6. Usually the last negotiation on Article 6 are quite complicated, especially in the middle of the weeks, but then finally run into like a convergent. They are very technical and very procedural, and I was saying also during our meetings. But just to highlight on Article 6.2, it is important to notice that there are lot of projects that are running under this cooperative approach, especially bilateral agreements to reinforce the mitigation efforts of both of the countries that are cooperating under Article 6.2. There has been like the first cycle of technical report review, and also the Secretary launched new dialogues and new capacity building efforts properly to foster and start this mechanism of running cooperative approach. Also, some fund has been allocated in order to support this project under Article 6.2. Under 6.4, the main thing to notice is that has been welcomed the annual supervisory body report. The supervisory body is this, we say, guarantee body to look overall the different projects that are exchanging the new carbon markets or the 6.4 emission reduction credits. In 6.4, contrary to the 6.2, there could be also the engagement of other entities that are not states through properly this mechanism, and the supervisory body is overlooking over that. So there has been the first report. There has been some procedural issues like the elections of the members of the supervisory body, also regarding the gender balance over that, and so on and so forth. And also has been postponed the deadline to transit from the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, basically the Kyoto Protocol, to the credits under Article 6.4. Basically, the supervisory body and the Secretariat now is also managing the transition to this new regime of the carbon markets, we can say, even though they are not anymore carbon markets. Article 6.4 has been welcomed the report of the Glasgow company that have the role to create enabling frameworks to no-market approaches to collaboration that are not in a way regulated by markets. And basically, new capacity building has been, decided and implemented, especially with the lead of Japan, that has a very strong role to foster knowledge about that. Next slide, please. Next, okay. Just to conclude, the expectation was basically that this negotiation could finalize the rule book that was designed in Glasgow. All the COPs after Glasgow are working over that to have a strong asset and strong framework for the new asset of carbon market exchange. But of course, a lot of concern are about the climate justice and also environmental integrity. Everything is done to not run into a sort of far west or wild west on carbon credit. That unfortunately is a little bit what's going on. And of course, also on the point of view of health, we have to monitor that. Some politics, there is a strong debate, especially between China and Europe, of the CBAM and ETS market that in a way can represent a sort of limitation in global exchange, in global collaboration. But I mean, that's a very technical thing. But there is a lot of politics among especially these two blocks. How to put health into the discussion. Now, as I said, the discussion is very procedural. but in my opinion, it's important now to find out indicators that can measure the mitigation co-benefits, because it's all about that when we're talking about Article 6, how to measure the mitigation effort that can contribute, for example, under the cooperative approach. And on this, the discussion is still too much onto the rule, onto the framework of regulation and so on and so forth. But in my opinion, we have to prepare properly to have strong indicators to measure the health co-benefits that indeed can come as a added value to the market of this cooperative approach. And that's it. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you, Domenico, and sorry that we're running over time. As in we're running over time, not you. There is one question from Asaba Hussein in the chat in case you have a chance to reply, but I'll turn it over to Nova on GST and I'll round us up on finance. Nova.
Thanks, Jess. So for those who don't know what the Global Stocktake is, or GST, it's essentially the report card of the Paris Agreement. The first one concluded in 2023 at COP28, which is where we got language on transitioning away from fossil fuels for the first time. So that's huge. But now we are looking for the second GST, and then also what came out of the first GST, which is called this UAE dialogue, which is meant to give conversation on implementing some of the outcomes from the first global stocktake. So the expectation for COP30 was to finalize the scope of this dialogue, whether it's going to be implementing all GST outcomes or just the finance outcomes, which has been a conversation for the last 2 years. There was also expectation that there will be some sort of plan going forward for the second global stocktake, especially as it relates to the seventh report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, which became quite a sticking point throughout the global stocktake negotiations, partly because some parties are specifically trying to get IPCC away from being labeled the best available science. And this was taking place both in the GST and also just transition and the cover decision text. So there's been quite an effort to essentially water down any language associating IPCC with the best available science, partly because the IPCC is having a lot of these scenarios for mitigation and et cetera, emission reductions. Some of the other politics is some parties wanted loss and damage to be, instead of an emerging theme, to be a concrete theme in the second global stocktake, as it has been elevated in the last few years. And then also related to the timing of what's a technical phase of the global stocktake, which is where they gather a bunch of the information and have a technical synthesis report of how countries are doing, and then the political phase. And they're trying to figure out how to time that with the IPCC seventh report, which operates on a 7-year timeline, and the GST operates on a 5-year timeline. So there's a real risk of not including the IPCC AR7 report. In terms of health in these negotiations, it's fairly minimal for explicit health references, but obviously health is integrated in the IPCC and health co-benefits, et cetera. So some of the outcomes here is the scope of the dialogue was finalized, and it's going to be both on finance and the GST outcomes, which may not seem like a big deal, but it's a huge deal because that's been a sticking point for the last 2 years. In terms of what the IPCC language, what they ended up being, as opposed to IPCC as the best available science, which was what the original language was, it is now the best available science, and then a bunch of other words, including the IPCC. So it's definitely watering down the IPCC as the best available science. So that's something that we are going to be looking out for in the future, and I encourage everyone else to as well. And then there's also vagueness on the timing of the second GST in terms of this technical phase and political phase. And so it's not yet certain how the IPCC AR7 report is actually going to be included in the global stocktake, which is concerning considering the AR6 report was heavily included in the IPCC. And then what's next is just the 2 UAE dialogues. There's going to be a submission for input for those. Thanks, Jess.
Thanks, Nova. I am going to do finance in 1 minute. and really want to acknowledge Tara Daniel from the Women's Environment and Development Organization, who didn't write these slides, but gave me a bunch of useful information to feed into them. And she's on leave today, otherwise you'd be hearing from her. But from COP30, we really needed progress on climate finance, given that the outcome from COP29 was so insufficient. There was a roadmap called the Baku to Belém roadmap that was supposed to look at scaling up the 300 billion to 1.3 trillion. 300 billion was what came out of COP29. There's been interest from developed countries in talking more about Article 2.1c, which is on wider financial flows beyond what developed countries provide directly to developing countries. India, Arab states, and some other parties really wanted space for discussing Article 9.1. So public finance, that ended up being included in the Mutirao text, which Nova started talking about earlier. It was a constant theme across different rooms that there can be no climate action without climate finance. The EU was willing to talk about finance from developed countries to developing countries as part of a bigger finance picture. So sort of slightly moving away from what its own responsibilities might be under the Paris Agreement and trying to put these in a wider context to slightly reduce focus specifically on that. And also developed countries wanted to look at who else might be able to provide this finance, not just developed countries, but maybe wealthy developing countries, which is part of where this interest in Article 2.1c also comes from. Next slide, please. In terms of where health came up, it didn't come up in any specific negotiating rooms, so this is a really glaring omission. In terms of what we got out of COP, there's going to be a 2-year work program as set out in the Mutirao decision on a 2-year on public climate finance. The Baku to Belém roadmap that was published just before COP is really, really heavy on private finance, which isn't going to be the solution that we need to get from 300 billion to 1.3 trillion on Article 2.1c, so wider financial flows. There'll be an annual high-level dialogue. And on Article 9.5, which is on planning and reporting by developed countries on their public finance provision. There's some small improvements in what that reporting should look like, but it's not as substantive as anybody might have hoped. There were outcomes on other finance items. We don't have time to go into them now, but notable that outside of the negotiations, the Tropical Forest Forever facility fell short in terms of the pledging total from what the goal for those pledges would be. There are submissions that can be made on the Standing Committee on Finance Annual Forum. That's the deadline for that is January 31st. For shaping that dialogue on Article 2.1c, the deadline is the 28th of February. And there are meetings coming up for the boards of the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund. We've got one final slide and then we will release everybody. Please keep posting questions in the chat in case there's anything final that we can manage in writing. Jenny, back to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jess. So the discussion in the chat has been really dynamic and fantastic. Really appreciate all of you joining us for this session, and we'd love to stay connected. Many of you, I know from seeing your names in the list here, that are already well connected to GCHA, but if you're not yet connected or you'd like to become more connected, there are a number of ways to do that. Health organizations can become a GCHA member organization. Individuals can sign up to become a climate and health champion. Youth folks involved in climate and health can join the Youth Climate and Health Network. We have a quarterly newsletter. Jess runs a climate and health policy email list for those really interested specifically in the policy arena. And then we also have a resources page. I've posted those links in the chat, and I know we'll be sharing the slides as well after this webinar. So the links are hyperlinked from that last slide, and we would love to have you become more connected to GCHA so we can continue these kinds of very rich conversations in the future.
Thank you, Jenny. And that is now all from us. Really grateful to Dungan for providing translation. Really grateful to all of our expert guest speakers and wishing everybody a really good rest of their days and looking forward to heading into 2026 with such a wonderful community. We're going to need each other and looking forward to working with you all. Thank you.